My name is Susan English. I'm the museum coordinator. I work with the Historical Society on programs. And I'd like to welcome you to the April program meeting of the Addison Historical Society. We are pleased to have as our speaker this evening Richard C. Lindberg, a lifelong Chicagoan. Richard is the author, journalist, and research historian. Over the past 40 years, he has written and published how many books, Rich?
It'll be 20 this year.
20 books, wow. They've dealt with aspects of city history, politics, criminal justice, ethnicity, and obviously sports. We were introduced to Rich through the Donning Company publishers of Brookfield, Missouri, who the Village of Addison contracted with last year to publish an updated history of Addison. Very much impressed with his work and resume, the village hired Rich last summer to research and write a comprehensive history of the village, commencing after the publication of the centennial history, A Village of Friendship, in 1984 to the present. And I believe the library has brought a copy of the Village of Friendship book. Pre-sales of the new books will begin this summer at the museum, and there are flyers at your tables, at your seats, with contact information should you be interested in purchasing the upcoming book. We are also doing a reprint of the original centennial book. Those are out of print, and I do have a waiting list of people who are interested in that. So we're going to reprint the old book. Rich is writing the new book, and then he's going to write an addendum dealing with the centennial celebration in Addison, because that did not get covered in the original book. And we expect the publication to be at the end of this year, hopefully in time for the holidays. So we're going to do some pre-sales during the summer, and then the book should be coming in late fall. When I asked Rich to speak at this meeting, I did so for two reasons. First, I wanted to introduce this distinguished historian to our local community in advance of our own book's publication. My second reason was really born out of my own curiosity. When I took the job as museum coordinator for the village a couple of years ago, I soon learned that Addison once almost became home for the Chicago White Sox while poking through the Society's news clipping files one day. I've always wanted to know the, quote, inside story of what really happened. With Rich's role as the official team historian for the Chicago White Sox and his extensive knowledge of all White Sox history, I knew that I could not pass up this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. So please join me tonight in welcoming Mr. Richard C. Lindberg, historian, author, and White Sox fan, to Addison.
Thank you, Susan, for that wonderful and gracious introduction. And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So nice to see you here, and thank you for inviting me out. I'm pleased to report that the Volume 2 of the Addison history is progressing very nicely. It's moving into its final phases of writing, and our challenge before us is to acquire photos. And I encourage every one of you, if you have photos you would like to share for the book, to get in touch with Susan. That will probably be one of our biggest challenges, is just getting the photos. But it's going to be a beautiful volume. I've done 3 of my 19 books I've done with Addison. I did a history of Northeastern Illinois University that was published in 2017. It was a 150-year anniversary, a book that was written from scratch. There had been no previous institutional history. And I'm also an employee in City Hall in Chicago, and I wrote a 57 biographical sketches of the former chairman of the Committee on Finance, and that was an interesting project. Politics indeed are always interesting. But I wear many hats as an author and as a writer, but the common thread to all of them is my deep and abiding interest in regional history, specifically Chicago history and its inner suburbs. And I must first thank and congratulate the village on so many dedicated and committed people working with the Historical Commission, the Historical Society, Susan as the keeper of the gate, and the deep and great appreciation all of you have for preserving the heritage and the history of this community. And in my discovery, I have found that it's a very interesting and unique history, certainly affirming the village motto, the Addison Advantage. One certainly gains an advantage by living and working in this community, and I'm very pleased to be a part of it. Now, as to my role as the White Sox historian, it's unofficial. I'm not paid by the White Sox for my opinions. Sometimes they don't always agree with what I have to say. 4 of my 20 books have been written about the White Sox. In fact, one of my vintage books is on the table right there, called Who's on Third? The Chicago White Sox Story. That was published in 1985, and that was, 1983, the year they won the American League West title, and that was my second book. Gradually over time, a role evolved with the Chicago White Sox. When I was in my 20s, I began sending in news clips and various historical items to Don Wentworth, who was the White Sox media person and keeper of the archival records. I have my role kind of formalized during the ownership of the second ownership of Bill Vecken in the late 1970s. In 1981, shortly after the team was sold to Jerry Reinsdorf, I was invited down there to take a look at their historic archive. And unlike the Addison Historical Society, which has wonderful record keeping, to my astonishment, I was shown 2 battered filing cabinets and was told, "There's your history." One of those filing cabinets had absolutely nothing in it. And there was like 5 manila folders with some statistical data, and that was it. And I said, "Well, where did your history go?" And they said, "Well, Don Wentworth, when he retired, he took it all with him." He had written nothing down. There had not been a book published on the Sox, a major book, since 1959, although my first book was a little paperback titled Stuck on the Sox, which I'm frankly very embarrassed about. It was a poorly written book, but we all make mistakes, as librarians indeed know. So I looked at that archive and I thought, gee, where is everything? Where's all the memorabilia? Well, that kind of also walked out the front door with the various ownerships who came and went. They took chunks of it with them, so there was really nothing. And this was the era before you had instant statistical data provided from New York by data collection companies. So really, I was a member of the Society of American Baseball Research, and I undertook my own research project to build the White Sox history for them. I started out with my first visit to the downtown library, which at that time was making, there were several locations before they moved to the Harold Washington Library, and I recorded day by day, week by week, month by month, the result of every White Sox game played from 1900 through 1966. 1966 was the first year that the team had actually kept the results of all of its games. And by scrolling through reams of microfilm, which caused me to get thicker and thicker glasses, I reconstructed this history of this ball club, this lost history. And it formed the basis of all my research material for the 4 books that I have since published on the team. My most recent edition is called Total White Sox. It went into its 3rd printing in 2011, and it's 700 pages long. It's a great doorstop. It'll hold the door open. It's yay thick. It's like a telephone book, and everything went into it, except the proverbial kitchen sink, as you will. But over the years, that role of historian evolved. I was pleased to work on the film 8 Men Out with director John Sayles in 1987. I was on location at Busch Stadium in Indianapolis where the ballpark sequences were filmed. I helped provide the historical material for the Gate 4 Diamond commemoration. There's inlaid historical milestones preserved in brick that form the shape of a diamond outside of Gate 4. I've written countless articles for them for their program. I helped them take their media guide, which in 1978 was only 30 pages long, to a 300-page book, which it is today. And the role has been interesting and fulfilling, but with the press of technology, it kind of negated the necessity to have a person doing that kind of research, since data was now at your fingertips on the computer. There's only one team in baseball that employs a full-time historian, and not surprisingly, no, not the Cubs, the Boston Red Sox. They're the only team that appreciates and recognizes the value of having a historian on staff. But I've had the pleasure of knowing and meeting all kinds of people in the front office, people from every ownership group, from the Arthur Allen Group, all the way through Reinsdorf, who I've known and talked to on a number of occasions, and Bill Veck, and others in the front office. And I kind of was very fortunate, just being a Northwest Side kid who loved the White Sox from the time he was 10 years old, to taking an active role and observing how a major league team operates from the inside. And it was an eye-opener, and it gained me a whole different kind of perspective. This year also marks the 100th anniversary of the Black Sox scandal, a defining moment in team history that altered the fortunes of that ball club. And I would argue that even in this era, we are still feeling the repercussions of that scandal. The White Sox, not the Cubs, were the dominant team in Chicago up through 1920. By the way, how many Sox fans do we have in the room? 2, 3, 5? Well, it looks like it's pretty evenly split. My apologies to the Cub fans if I say anything disparaging, but I grew up in a Cub neighborhood, and being a White Sox fan, as you might imagine, presented a great number of challenges. But the Black Sox scandal is going to be marked this year. There's going to be a lot of articles, stories about the Black Sox. It's still a great mystery wrapped inside of an enigma. And I basically have changed my views on it from being sympathetic to those 8 players to really seeing things from a whole different point of view. I think Charles Comiskey has been unfairly castigated and maligned as a tightwad and as a cheapskate, largely unfairly and factually untrue. It was written, the book 8 Men Out was written by Elliot Azanoff, and it's more of a political document espousing a point of view than a clear, concise history. SABRE, that organization I mentioned earlier, has just published a monograph, which is what you would call revisionist history, that takes a whole different look at the scandal and argues persuasively that Comiskey was not the villain in this. It was the 8 players who compromised their integrity in the sport of baseball for a payout, which is something I kind of came to the conclusion several years after I worked on 8 Men Out, just doing a lot of research and seeing things differently. Now, we almost moved to Addison. How many of you were living in the region when the Addison Move was under discussion? Don, I bet you remember that. And when I talk to people, they're often divided in opinion. Many will say, oh, they were using Addison as a bluff. They really weren't going to come. And then other people will say, well, why didn't they come? You know, they would have been welcome. Well, the White Sox had their feet in 2 camps. Stay in Chicago, move out to Addison. At the time, it was a very controversial decision. You know, when you are an institutional team and you have a charter member of the American League from 1900, approaching its 90th birthday in 1990, and you're anchored and locked in that one location, it's often kind of a gut-wrenching thing to pick up and move and leave an area. But the White Sox were forced into a position where they had to get out. They had to get a new stadium. There was no real compelling reason for them to try to renovate the old Comiskey Park. The ballpark had been poorly maintained throughout its history. It opened on July 1st, 1910, and over the years, especially after the scandal and when the team plummeted into the nether regions of the American League, and during the Depression, the Comiskey family really had no money to maintain the upkeep of that ballpark. Meanwhile, on the north side, the Wrigleys paid great attention to the infrastructure of Wrigley Field, particularly in the 1950s and 60s when Phil Wrigley took over. He wasn't a baseball man to begin with. He owned the team. His father, William, was the baseball fan, but Phil liked to tinker. He liked to work with machines. He liked to work with automobiles. He was interested in engineering. So he devoted his resources to maintaining the infrastructure of Wrigley Field, replacing I-beams, replacing concrete. None of that happened in Comiskey Park. It would get coats of paint on the exterior, and that was essentially it. The concrete, the I-beams from the 1927 renovation were basically there in 1987, 1988. In 1985, Dr. Bobby Brown, president of the American League, told Jerry Reinsdorf that he has to think about getting a new stadium, or the American League would insist upon the White Sox relocating elsewhere. Reinsdorf recalled that when he heard that news, he was kind of thunderstruck by the whole thing. He knew the ballpark had lots of problems. He was spending a lot of money each year renovating the place. It was literally on the verge of collapse. When they put in the hated skyboxes in back of home plate, for example, this is something the fans really thought was elitist. They discovered when they tore out that section of the wall in the upper deck behind home plate that it was quite likely that the upper deck was going to come crashing down into the lower deck and would have killed several thousand people if it happened during a game. So they had to repair that, and that was done during the off season. So they put in skyboxes, and the fans didn't like it. Then a section of the right field upper deck grandstand collapsed. Fortunately, that happened when the ballpark was empty on an off day. Millions of dollars were being pumped into just keeping Comiskey Park functional. And it didn't allow really for any kind of ballpark expansion where you could put in revenue generating skyboxes, at least not like the kind we see today in modern stadiums. So Reinsdorf knew he had a problem, but then when Dr. Bobby Brown told him that something needs to happen, that you need to get the support of the city of Chicago, downstate legislators, and proceed from there and get a new stadium. And he set a deadline. In 1985, he set a deadline of 1989 to get it done. He said you have to have substantial commitment from public bodies that this stadium will either be approved or in the process of construction or consider relocation. The White Sox had done a number of marketing studies indicating to them where their primary fan base would be located. The consensus was that the White Sox fans, of the generational White Sox fans, had moved far south, many of them into Indiana, or they had gone straight west along the Eisenhower Expressway, along the line of the Burlington line. Now Reinsdorf and his corporation Belcor, a real estate investment firm linked with Shearson American Express, had acquired property on Swift Road, the wetlands, and their marketing studies indicated that Addison would be an ideal location to build a new stadium. And this evolved over a 2-year period. There were construction reports done in Comiskey Park. I did a book called Stealing First in a Two-Team Town, which was published in 1994, which is the inside story of the building of the new ballpark. And it covers Addison, and it covers all of the problems that the ownership encountered. Reinsdorf made a blunder in calling a press conference in 1986 to put the Chicago media and the city of Chicago on alert that we have to have a new stadium, otherwise we're going to have to move. He literally repeated that in a very terse statement before a gathering of reporters, and he later admitted it was not the appropriate or proper way to drop a bombshell like that on the public. It was met with immediate hostility, a lot of anger and resentment. The ownership was never popular, at least not compared to Bill Veeck. I have my own theories on that, but maybe we'll address that later. And so, suffering an image problem, it was exacerbated by this surprise announcement that give us a new stadium or we're going to move out. And the sports columnists who were very favorable to the late Bill Veeck, for example, like Bill Gleason in the Chicago Sun-Times, just called Reinsdorf and his ownership group a bunch of hustlers who were trying to hustle the city of Chicago to pay for a brand new stadium. Well, what was not commonly known was just how many millions that the White Sox had pumped into just keeping the doors of old Comiskey Park opened. So Reinsdorf, having acquired this property in Addison on Swift Road, through the demographic marketing surveys that he conducted, came to the conclusion that Addison would be a perfect focal point to draw fans both from the northwest suburbs, from the south suburbs, and from Chicago. It seemed to be close enough into the city, but yet far enough out where they could develop their own marketing identity and they could cultivate their own fan base. Of course, conceding much of Chicago to the Cubs, but really since the Black Sox scandal, if you ask most baseball fans in Chicago, I would say by a 2-to-1 margin, they would identify themselves as Cub fans. It made sense to come out here. It presented an opportunity to really build something for the future, to increase sagging attendance in a neighborhood of Chicago that had suffered a dramatic decline in attendance over the years. The White Sox have always struggled with their attendance. And so for many good reasons, they proposed to come out here. Now, it had been in the works in 1984, 1985. Mayor Rosado had a number of meetings with Veeck and his investors and his executive vice president, Howard Pizer, Mike McClure, director of marketing and sales, and Paul Reese, who was kind of the point man in coordinating with the village. But it happened in a whirlwind, and it really didn't give, I think, the people of Addison a time to effectively weigh the pros and cons of such a thing as this. Because again, it was due to this time deadline that the American League had imposed upon Reinsdorf. Reinsdorf was a Brooklyn Dodger fan growing up, and when the Dodgers moved out of Brooklyn and moved to Los Angeles, it was a defining moment in his life, and he remembered that, and he said once that he didn't want it written on his tombstone that he was the guy who moved the White Sox out of Chicago, meaning Northeast Illinois, into another sunshine state. So the White Sox opened a office in the Village Commons on Lake Street. They conducted public meetings in the old Village Hall. They had a special event at the high school, Driscoll High School. Did any of you go to these public meetings or events that they held back in the 1986, 85? You did, Don, right? And what they found was that the response was not nearly as enthusiastic from the public as they had hoped. The appearance of sign-carrying picketers in Village Hall opposing the White Sox move were evident. And they didn't have a whole lot of support either from political leaders in DuPage County. The head of the DuPage County Board, Jack Kuffner, I think his name was very interested in this and was championing it. Mayor Rosado was for it. But there is that thing called public opinion, which must be respected. So the referendum was held in November of 1986. After over a year of planning and studying and lobbying and communicating. But really, I don't think a year was long enough to have gotten this done and to get the message across. The ballpark would have been an economic boom to the region, but at the time, we didn't have I-355 cutting through here. There was a tremendous concern on the part of residents that attending problems of crime would be imported from Chicago into the community. Traffic congestion was probably cited as the #1 reason people were opposed. Residents in the adjoining subdivision did not welcome the intrusion of 40,000 people and fireworks, and especially, of course, when they had to get up the following morning. But Howard Pizer tried to point out that baseball was played only 81 days of the year, and that the stadium itself was projected to be a baseball-only stadium. It wasn't going to be multi-purpose, so it would free up a lot of time. And also, if the feeling was, well, it could be also, the property could also be developed for a shopping area, a new mall, different purposes. But traffic studies told the White Sox that a shopping mall would create more traffic density throughout the year than a baseball-only stadium. These were arguments that the administration tried to present, but the feeling quickly became a realization that there just wasn't enough unanimous support for this thing. So the referendum failed. Don, what was the spread? It was like a 300 or 400 votes, right?
Well, no, like 40.
Okay. Now that was not, in my mind, that was not a mandate saying you can't come out here. Looking back on it, I would say now that it was an indication that we need to do more work to maybe sell the idea of professional baseball for Addison, to give it more time, and then try to approach it again. But the trouble was, if the team didn't have the time to do that. After the advisory referendum failed in November 1986, the White Sox were left there standing with not many options. There were architectural preservationists who said, well, we can just remodel Comiskey Park, but okay, where would the team play? The Cubs made it very clear they would not be allowed to play in Wrigley Field. Where would you play? Where would a major league team play? Their off games up in Milwaukee when the Brewers weren't there. It was a problem. And it was at that point when Mayor Harold Washington, a native Southsider who had been a White Sox fan growing up, made the declaration that the White Sox belong in Chicago at 35th and Shields. This is where they are from. This is where they shall stay. And Washington indicated that he would seek bipartisan support from the General Assembly to appoint a board, a stadium authority, to kind of oversee and shepherd through the funding legislation, and to create this authority to oversee the new ballpark if and when it was going to be built. So with Washington's mandate, the Sox more or less recommitted to the South Side. Harold Washington had a very prominent quitclaim attorney named Earl Neal, one of the people I interviewed when I was doing the book on the stadium. And Earl Neal was an African American who understood quitclaim, and he understood the economic benefits that would come for the residents who were living in the South Armor community just south of 35th Street, and they would be relocated into better housing in areas of the South Side like the Gap and in Bronzeville and other locales. But it was at that point when things seemed to be progressing. The Stadium Authority was created with the cooperation of Governor Jim Thompson. The board was appointed, and the thing seemed to be progressing. Community activists got involved and steered the whole project into a very divisive argument over gentrification. There was a deep racial divide between groups, and the Sox ownership was portrayed as a money-grubbing group that was just trying to get a stadium built for no cost. Well, in our modern age, baseball stadiums are not built by families anymore. It requires a substantial investment of public money to do so. And interestingly enough, the White Sox Stadium came in well under budget, $119 million. And when you look at stadiums today that are being built, you're talking $1 billion or $2 billion. So this ballpark, it was built on the cheap. And the kind of park we got wasn't the kind of park we certainly had dreamed of. It was similar to what was being planned for Addison. It was designed by the HOK firm, which is the architectural firm du jour for so many ballparks in the United States. But it came in under budget, and that seemed to be the whole thing that most people were concerned about. The hotel motel tax, which was passed by the General Assembly at the 11th hour on July 1st, 1988, guaranteed that hotel motel revenues, public money, would be used to build this ballpark. There were a whole lot of Cub fans and Cardinal fans in that General Assembly that night. And Thompson, who worked his magic, literally stopped the clock at the stroke of midnight. And I will never forget the television coverage. And he was walking up and down the aisles, whispering in the ears of various legislators, and they're going like that, and he's going like that. He's making his point. You don't know what he's saying, but you had to wonder how many deals was he cutting, and how many promises was he making to all these Cardinal fans from downstate who happened to represent Illinois legislative districts. So it got passed by the skin of its teeth, and the White Sox were saved. 4 times during their history, the White Sox have threatened to leave Chicago. We nearly moved to St. Petersburg this time, because when all else failed before that vote, the Sox were going to go to St. Petersburg. The night before the vote, Paul Jensen, the media relations director for the White Sox, he's retired and living in Arizona now, he told me, he said, we have 2 press releases ready to issue tomorrow morning following the legislative session. One, saying we're sorry that we're leaving Chicago, but circumstances dictate that we have to move to Florida. The other, we're so pleased to remain here in Chicago and to start anew in this beautiful new stadium. They did not know which way the vote was going to go, but it really took Cub fan Jim Thompson to save the deal. Now, we got the new stadium. It opened up in 1991. The old ballpark was torn down simultaneously. What has been the outcome of all that, particularly with reference to the Village of Addison? You should know that in the entire history of the new ballpark, now called Guaranteed Rate Field, in only 1 year did the White Sox manage to outdraw the Cubs in home attendance, and that was in 1992. The year after the ballpark opened up. The Sox have fallen back into the same old familiar pattern of lackluster attendance. Of course, their poor play on the field has a lot to do with that, but nevertheless, I think that the decision to build across the street at 35th and Shields, while it did save the team for Chicago, in the long run has proven not to be wise or prudent, and it's my opinion that they would have been much better off coming out to Addison and to see, where that would have taken them. My feeling is that they would have had a much greater regional presence and would have developed several new generations of younger fans coming to this ballpark that would have been here. The city of Chicago probably contemptuously would have probably insisted that they change their name to the Addison White Sox. Don't think they would have been happy keeping the name Chicago. But that is my overview of the stadium situation. I do have a presentation now that I'm going to go into on the history of the ball club and some of its famous moments, some of its setbacks, a journey through White Sox history. And I'm not salaried by the White Sox. My opinions are my own, and I've been called a team historian. Paul Jensen proclaimed me as the team historian back in 1986, and it's kind of stuck around over the years, although my role is much more diminished today than it was, say, 25 years ago. The story of the White Sox rightfully begins with this man, Charles Albert Comiskey, born in 1859 on the west side of Chicago. He was the son of John Comiskey, who was a prominent Chicago alderman and political leader. And believe it or not, he had the nickname Honest John Comiskey. How often can you say that about political leaders in our modern age? Well, Honest John envisioned that his son would take up a useful trade, be a plumber, for example. Well, he didn't want to be a plumber. From my research, he saw his first baseball game in 1870. Chicago's first professional baseball game was played at Dexter Park in the Union Stockyards. At that time, the idea of paying to see two competitive teams play a game of baseball was nearly unheard of. But the Cincinnati Red Stockings of 1869 went on a nationwide tour challenging all local teams. So the Chicago White Stockings were created in 1870. They wore blue and white uniforms, and young Comiskey, age 11, was at that game. Dexter Park was a racing oval, and it's where they used to have horses during livestock shows. So, impressed with baseball, he became a baseball player. He entered the professional ranks in 1879. He was the manager of the St. Louis Browns of the American Association in the 1880s. In 1886, his St. Louis team defeated the forerunners of the Chicago Cubs in what was one of the first modern World Series between the American Association and the National League. Upon retirement from professional baseball, he became a baseball owner, and with help from his father, who was certainly financially well off, he bought a little team in Sioux City, Iowa, called the Sioux City Cornhuskers. They were struggling. They were a baseball group 9 that didn't have much support from the locals. They were part of the Western League of minor league baseball teams. So Comiskey bought the team and moved it to St. Paul, Minnesota, where they became known as the St. Paul Saints, playing across the river from the Minneapolis Millers team. And they had a very spirited rivalry. Comiskey owned and operated that team from 1895 until 1899. In 1899, his friend and drinking pal from Cincinnati, Byron Bancroft Johnson, who was president of the Western League, got together with Comiskey and decided that we're going to take our little operation, our little Midwestern circuit, and challenge organized baseball and declare ourselves to be the second major league. The White Sox were given permission to relocate to Chicago. Next, Susan. And they acquired title to a little ballpark at 39th and Wentworth called the Southside Grounds. It seated no more than 3,000 or 4,000 people. A rickety wooden structure where a team called the Chicago Wanderers, a cricket team, had some prominence in the 1880s and 1890s. They were painting and nailing in boards on the very opening day, the very same day in April of 1900 when the team moved in to play their first game. Comiskey outfitted the team in crisp blue uniforms, a style that Bill Veeck later adapted when he took over ownership of the team in 1976. And in its peak, it seated no more than 5,000 or 6,000 people. So imagine what it must have been like during the 1906 World Series when 30,000 people tried to jam into that ballpark. They were standing in roped-off sections of the outfield. They were standing on top of the roof. Kids were climbing lamp poles to get a glimpse. St. George's Parish, right across the street where the Dan Ryan is today, they were climbing the spires of the church to catch a glimpse. The White Sox became very popular. They won the first official pennant in 1901. Although they played in 1900 as a minor league, in 1901, Johnson officially declared war on the National League and said, hey, we are the second major league. Well, all he did really was just divorce himself from the National League, but he rated the National League for players, top players, and they won the pennant. The only time in White Sox history where they won back-to-back pennants was the year it didn't count, 1900, and 1901, the year it did count, the first official American League season. Sox had no one to play in that 1901 World Series, managed by ex-Cub Clark Griffith. But between 1904 and 1908, the White Sox, in their glory days, went down to the final week of the season, challenging for the American League pennant. In only one of those years, though, did they emerge as league champions, and that was the greatest year of them all. 1906, the only all-Chicago World Series, when the powerful Cubs, winners of 116 games, lost the World Series to the White Sox 4-2. The hitless wonders. Next. This is Comiskey in his wooden fire trap ballpark at 39th and Wentworth. Modestly successful entrepreneur, very popular in his day as a sportsman. He was, in 1908, the neighbors in Bridgeport wanted him to run for alderman, but he refused. He built up a very loyal, dedicated fan base, mostly Irish, first-generation Irish Americans who lived in Bridgeport. But the White Sox were a very competitive, successful team. And those years firmly established them in the Windy City. Notice all that wood. The ballpark was a fire trap. And because of the large overflow crowds, they decided that they needed a new ballpark. Comiskey bought property at 35th and Shields from the estate of former Mayor John Wentworth. John Wentworth was the largest landholder in Chicago. He owned land on the south side from Lake Michigan all the way south and west to Summit, to give you an idea. So Comiskey bought this property from his daughter, Roxana Wentworth Bowen, for a sum of $150,000 in 1909. Next. This is a photo taken of fans lining up outside the wooden grandstand at 39th Street. White Sox popularity grew, and even though the Cubs were also competitive at that time, they underwent several different ownerships, but the continuity of the Comiskey ownership created a lot of fans. So in 1910, on July 1st, with his own money, Charles Comiskey built the baseball palace of the world. It was the third steel and concrete stadium to be built in America, and it opened on that property at 35th and Shields with a seating capacity of 32,000. Quite a change from the South Side grounds. Forbes Field in Pittsburgh and Shibe Park in Philadelphia were the only two modern equivalents of that era. And they likened it to the old Roman Colosseum. And that's one reason why Comiskey acquired the nickname the Old Roman. Next. He was beloved by his fans and by the neighbors. Some say that he had a very prominent nose and that he had a Roman gladiatorial nose. That's the other reason given on how he acquired that nickname. But he had a lot of ingenious ideas. White Sox popularity also meant media exposure. And in 1913, on the conclusion of the season, Comiskey took his White Sox to the New York Giants on a world tour, playing baseball, barnstorming from Seattle all the way around the world, through Asia, through the Philippines, across the Middle East, where you see these players are posing in front of the Sphinx. Believe it or not, they played a baseball game in the sand. John McGraw's Giants against the White Sox, they created a diamond in the sand and played a baseball game in front of the Sphinx. They ended the tour in March 1914 in London's Wembley Stadium before the King of England, but somehow baseball never caught on in England, although during their tour of Japan, it gave the Japanese their first exposure to baseball, and by 1934, Japan had its own major league in business. Next. Shoeless Joe Jackson, a figure of endless controversy and debate, came to the White Sox in a very profitable trade in 1915. A couple of minor leaguers went to Cleveland for this greatest hitter of them all, maybe second only to Ty Cobb, one of the last 400 hitters in Major League Baseball, country boy from Greenville, South Carolina. They called him Shoeless because supposedly he had played baseball in rough gravel infields barefoot. I can't imagine that, even as tough as these guys might have been. I don't think I'd want to play on a gravel infield without my shoes, but Joe Jackson was a great player. Unfortunately, he got caught up with the other 7 players, the so-called Black Sox, to throw the World Series of 1919. Next. This is that photo of I spoke of with Comiskey's prominent nose. Maybe it was the old Roman nose, but this is Comiskey at the height of his fame, at the peak years of his ownership, when there were clear skies and smooth sailing ahead. And you contrast this photo, taken about 1914, to images of him taken a decade later. After the heartbreak of the Black Sox scandal, he was a broken man, and he had aged like 30 years in just over a decade. Became a recluse, lived in his cottage up in Eagle River, Wisconsin, where he had entertained so many sports writers and players in the postseason. He would invite the Chicago Press Corps up to Eagle River, Wisconsin, and they would feast on fish and turkey, and they would recite poetry in the woods. They loved Shakespeare. They called themselves the Woodland Bards, the famous bard, William Shakespeare. And in later years, the dining room in Old Comiskey Park became known as the Bard's Room. And even today, in the new ballpark, the press dining area is still called the Bard's Room. Next. Comiskey his White Sox won a world championship in 1917, defeating the New York Giants 4-2. A dynasty was in the making. This was a great team, this 1917 White Sox. The only team in our local history, our own White Sox history, to win 100 games in a season. We came close in 2005 with 99, but still it holds up. The manager was Clarence Pants Rowland. He was 36. They called him Pants because in those days it was a sarcastic reference to a little boy wearing knickers. He was thought to be too young to be a major league manager, so they called him Pants. He's a kid. He's 36 years old. He's wearing knickers, but Rowland guided them to a World Series victory, but he was replaced by an older man, William Kid Gleason, who, after the war year of 1918, came back to lead the White Sox to their 4th championship season. The Black Sox saga of 1919 unfolded. This was a great team, well balanced between veterans and young players. Swede Risberg was the talented shortstop that Nelson Algren memorialized in the famous poem, "The Swede Was a Hard Guy." Chick Gandil, the ringleader of the Fix, played first base. Joe Jackson in left field. Buck Weaver, the third baseman. Perhaps the only sympathetic player of the 8 was Buck Weaver. He didn't really participate in the scandal. He had knowledge of it, but in his own mind, he did the honorable thing by not reporting his suspicions and what he knew about the plot to throw the World Series to the Reds, to the White Sox, or to Major League Baseball. And for that, he paid a heavy price. He was banned for life and never reinstated, despite many, many appeals to the Commissioner of Baseball. Next. These are 2 ticket stubs to the 1919 World Series. For $5, you could get a ringside seat right in back of first base. And the upper deck box was $5.50 between first and third. The Sox didn't get their upper deck in the outfield until 1927. Next. Well, the White Sox lost an expanded best-of-9 World Series, 5-3 to the Reds in October of 1919. The scandal broke a year later. Baseball had been under a cloud of suspicion, really going back 30 years. The presence of gamblers in stadiums compromised the sport. There were many players who were suspected of throwing games to beat betting odds and collect payoffs from gamblers who consorted with the players after hours in saloons and in hotel lobbies on the road. So it was nothing new. In fact, a grand jury was summoned in September 1920 to investigate a Cub pitcher by the name of Claude Hendricks, who was suspected of throwing a game to the Phillies in Wrigley Field. And Claude Hendricks, a completely forgotten figure in baseball history, was the catalyst for the Black Sox scandal. Because then Hendricks said, well, if you think I'm crooked, look at those 8 White Sox guys. And the rumors of the fix had circulated throughout the post-1919 season. So the grand jury summoned Psychotti and Jackson, and under intense questioning, they both admitted that they had thrown games deliberately, and their friends, the other 6 players forming the 8 Black Sox, were all summoned in. And the White Sox were only a game out of first place against the Cleveland Indians, and Comiskey suspended all 8 players, and it cost them a chance to go to the World Series for the 2nd year in a row. There were rumors that I believe are substantial, that historians have never bothered really to check up on, that in the closing weeks of the 1920 season, during an East Coast road trip, the White Sox were deliberately losing games again. But that was lost in the undertow of this scandal and the indictment. These players and their lawyers, Michael Ahern, second from the right, was a lawyer assigned to defend them. He also defended Al Capone in the 1920s. Buck Weaver is seated right next to him, third from the right. He's smiling, he's confident, he believes he's going to be acquitted. Well, what was the charge? Well, it boiled down to a conspiracy charge that they had together conspired to defraud one fan, a guy by the name of Charles K. Nims, of $250 that he had bet on the World Series. There was no conspiracy statute in the Illinois laws that would address the deliberate throwing of a baseball game for money. So the jury acquitted them, but this man, Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis, a federal judge in Chicago, was appointed commissioner to clean up baseball. And as his first official act, he banned the White Sox, the so-called Black Sox, for life. Why were they called the Black Sox? Not because of the tarnished reputation, it's because the players never laundered their uniforms. They were dirty, they were stained, and it said that many people said, well, they're Black Sox because they're dirty. Well, it could also mean they were dirty because they were also crooked. Next. What followed was what I call the 30 years of the wandering in the desert years. Between 1921 and 1950, the White Sox lingered in the nether regions of the American League. With their 8-star players gone, the team floundered through the 1920s. But the first baseball game to be broadcast on radio was a Cub White Sox game in 1923, and that man seated there is Hal Totten, and he was the first White Sox play-by-play announcer, and he was later succeeded by Bob Elson, who broadcast White Sox baseball from 1930 to 1970. But Hal Totten, that was the press row. If you went to a ball game in 1923 and you sat behind home plate, you could converse and gab with the writers who were covering the game and it wasn't until many years later, in 1949, that they actually built a press box for the media. Next. Charles Comiskey died in Eagle River in October of 1931. He left the ownership of the team to his son, John Lewis, who was seated. John Lewis, who had suffered rheumatic fever as a child, was grossly overweight and was medically unsound for much of his life. They built the first elevator in Comiskey Park to transport him up to the upper deck so he could watch the game in comfort. Harry Grabiner, to the right, began working for the White Sox as a soda pop boy in 1905, and he rose to become general manager of the team in 1945. He was with the White Sox for over nearly 45 years. His daughter was June Travis, who was a Hollywood actress in the 1930s and 1940s. I think you have to be a real movie buff to remember her name, but she had some minor celebrity in those days. Next. Despite the losing years, and there were many of them, the White Sox really only had winning seasons in 1925, 26, 1936, 37, 39, and 43. And that was it between 1921 and 1950. But they had great individual players that stood out. Ted Lyons, who won 260 games with the White Sox. Imagine what he would have done with the Yankees. He might have won 500 games with the Yankees. But the White Sox ownership didn't have a whole lot of money in the Depression. So what they did was, on Ted Lyons' special day, they asked the fans to contribute 10 cents apiece to buy him a car. And that was the fans' gift to Ted Lyons, and there he is. He would manage the White Sox for a couple of years in the late 1940s, and he was enshrined in baseball's Hall of Fame in 1955. Next. We had colorful managers. James J. Dykes, Jimmy Dykes, was the longest-serving White Sox manager, took over in 1934 and guided the team through the 1946 season. This is a game where he's holding a hot water bottle to his cheek. You can see how cold it is. Look at the coaches, they got their hands shoved in their pockets. Does anybody want to venture a guess as to what game this was? It was a very famous game in baseball history. Anybody? It was opening day of 1940. Bob Feller threw the only opening day no-hitter in baseball history. 1-0. There was no scoreboard in center field. The wind came whipping in on that frozen, frigid day. I interviewed Feller many years later, and he had a 90-mile-an-hour plus fastball, and he said that wind in center field made that 90-mile-an-hour fastball 115 miles an hour. So these were the 1940s. They were pretty grim days. John Lewis Comiskey died in 1939. The team was given to his widow, Grace Reedy Comiskey, and she was kind of a caretaker for her son, Charles, the old Roman's grandson. And her interest was really only to financially break even each year. A successful year was to draw 500,000 people into the park. With 500,000, they knew they could make a few dollars, and it didn't really matter how well the team played, just let's draw 500,000 fans. Next. There were characters and there were moments. The guy who's crossing home plate, about to have his hand shake by number 4, Lou Kapling, one of the greatest shortstops of all time in White Sox history. His name was Pat Seri. They called him Fat Pat Seri. On his moment in the sun in 1948, he clubbed 4 home runs in a game in Philadelphia. Pat Seri, who maybe had 12 or 13 home runs for his entire career, hits 4 in one game, which kind of tells you that every man or every woman has their great day in the sun, at least once in their lifetime. Next. Grace Comiskey is on the left, daughter Dorothy to her immediate left, son Chuck, and manager Jimmy Dykes, 1948. This is the year the White Sox turned the corner. Chuck Comiskey was just 22 years of age when he was elevated to the vice presidency of the team by his mother, Grace. Grace was kind of an institution. It's been said by a lot of people in the know that she was quasi-alcoholic and who used to leave her fur coats in a number of South Side bars in Hyde Park where she lived, and the bartender always had to deliver her fur coat back to their apartment. The Comiskeys lived in Hyde Park during those years. But Chuck was a young man. He was sent to Waterloo, Iowa to run the minor league team, and he was given full authority to rebuild the White Sox however he saw fit. And Chuck, who was a resident of Hinsdale for many years, I spent some time with him and I interviewed him and I said, well, how did you go about doing that? He said, Rich, he said, I blatantly stole every idea from the New York Yankees. I stole their ideas on building a farm system. I stole their copy of their uniform. He said, if they were successful, I figured I could be successful doing exactly what they did. Well, the first thing he did was fire Ted Lyons as manager after 101 losses in 1948. That was the only year in baseball history in Chicago when the Cubs and Sox both finished in last place during the same season. Must have been a great year of baseball that year. So Lyons was out and new managers and new ownership or new executives came in next. He hired Frank Lane from the Big Ten to be his general manager, a novice that nobody had ever heard of. Think of him as the Theo Epstein of his era. He hired Paul Richards, a young manager from the Seattle team of the Pacific Coast League. And as this Chicago Herald American cartoon illustrates, the White Sox jalopy was running in reverse in 1948. But with the hiring of Paul Richards to begin the 1951 season, the outlook suddenly became that much more brighter. And it kicked into motion a 17-year reign for the White Sox in the first division of the American League. Only two other teams under the old pre-divisional structure had nearly as many consecutive seasons in the first division: the Baltimore Orioles and those great Yankee teams of the 1950s and 1960s. So Richard says, I understand you've been having trouble with this car running in reverse. And Comiskey says, we feel the steering wheel is in the right hands. Okay, next. That's Marilyn Monroe, a visitor to Brookside Park in Pasadena in 1950 when the White Sox were training out there. Now, Marilyn, as glamorous as she is not the reason I show you this photo. It's the uniform. Remember I said earlier how Comiskey decided to make the White Sox look like the Yankees? He created the Old English logo, SOX, in the tradition of the famous NY of the Yankees. He added pinstripes to that uniform to begin the 1952 season. So in essence, the White Sox uniform was almost a carbon copy of the New York Yankee uniform of those great years. Marilyn and a lot of Hollywood actors and actresses often toured the minor league camps when teams played out in California. The Cubs played on Catalina Island for a number of years. So publicity strategists would like to pose them with White Sox and players from various other teams. And there was a whole set of these photos of Marilyn standing in the batter's box, running the bases, and so forth. Next. But I think that the White Sox years, at least the years that those of us of a certain age remember, were those great years of the late 1950s and early 1960s. The White Sox built their team to the contours of old Comiskey Park, a spacious ballpark, a dead ball era ballpark designed for low-scoring games, pitching and defense. And in Louis Aparicio on the left and Nellie Fox on the right, they cultivated marvelous defensive strength up the middle, and in Fox, a contact hitter, consistent 300 hitter, the kind of player I wish this year's team would have, but they don't, to give what I would call magic up the middle. This was the key to the White Sox success. Through the 50s, they were finishing either in second or third place behind the Yankees and the Indians. And as the team got older, we were wondering, will we ever see a pennant fly on the South Side? Next. The key to the success was the acquisition of Minnie Minoso, who was out here in Addison during I think one of the events at Driscoll High School. He was out here signing autographs, and probably been out here more than once. I've argued that Minnie has probably signed more autographs for every man, woman, and child in Chicago than any person alive. Minnie, as a goodwill ambassador, has been everywhere and at every function signing autographs. But he was acquired from Cleveland in April of 1951, and in his first major league game on May 1st, 1951, he slugged a home run. What was notable about that game was the opponent. The Yankees were playing the White Sox in Comiskey Park, and later on in the game, rookie Mickey Mantle hit his first career home run, the same game as Minnie. So Minnie and Mickey had their day. I'm sorry, I had to slip that one in. But there's a nice color shot of Minoso in Tampa, Florida, where the White Sox trained through the 1950s. Next. There's Comiskey. No, that's not a bazooka he's firing. He's introducing the first automatic pitching machine, the Iron Mike. And with him, of course, are three great White Sox mainstays from those wonderful pitching staffs. Dick Donovan to the right of Comiskey, early win acquired from the Indians for Minnie Minoso in 1957, and the great Billy Pierce, who just passed away a few years ago. gentleman, Billy Pierce, a guy who certainly belongs in baseball's Hall of Fame, but he was too modest, he was too self-effacing. Unlike Ron Santo, who made a big issue out of put me in the Hall of Fame every year, Pierce never said anything. He once said that if they elect me, that's fine. He says, but if I die and I don't go in, that's okay too. He was too dignified to complain about it, and perhaps if he had, he might have been inducted into the Hall. Next. But in the House of Comiskey in 1958, everything was torn asunder. Dorothy, who controlled 54% of the ownership stock, decided to retire to River Forest to raise her children and be with her husband, John Rigney, and she put her share of stock up for sale. Chuck Comiskey, believing he was entitled to the family discount, balked at the first mention of the sale price because it was a market value that he was asked to pay if he wanted to acquire Dorothy's stock. It led to a family feud, and Dorothy decided to sell the team. In the early months of 1959, the deal was finalized. Bill Veeck in the center and Hank Greenberg to the left came in and acquired the White Sox. The team to win the pennant in ¡59 was already assembled, largely through the genius of Comiskey, John Rigney, the farm director Glenn Miller, and the pieces were in place, and Veeck happened to be in the right place at the right time. Next. So with a talented ensemble cast of a lot of singles hitters, great pitching, great bullpen, but not much firepower as far as the home run, this veteran White Sox team pulled through and won the pennant of 1959. The Yankees had an off year and a whole lot of injuries, so the Sox kind of just slipped in. Managed by Al Lopez and anchored by Louis Aparicio, Nellie Fox, Billy Pierce, Early Wynn, Jim Landis, a great veteran team that coalesced in kind of like a last hurrah. Next. That's Jungle Jim Rivera, one of the beloved players. He wasn't much of a hitter, but here he is slamming one of his infrequent home runs. Al Lopez is reaching out to shake his hand. Number 20 is Earl Torgeson. It's said that Earl Torgeson never found a fight he didn't want to be a part of. He always used to have a great proclivity for punching out drunks in hotel bars, or so they said. He later became a mailman up in Snohomish, Washington. Next. In the World Series, they faced the Dodgers. Look at that sea of white shirts in the background in the LA Coliseum. Bill Veeck had the White Sox wear special white hosiery for the World Series. One of the things that Chuck Comiskey did in 1949 was change the hosiery to have its stirrup, the kind of familiar stirrup look. Because the one cardinal rule that his grandfather enforced is that forevermore the Chicago White Sox will wear solid white hosiery, because they are, after all, the White Sox. Well, Comiskey got rid of that clunky looking uniform with the block SOX, gave him stirrup stockings, and had a much more crisper, I think, business-like approach. But Veeck gave them the white stockings just for that World Series. Sox lost 4-2. This was only the third season that LA had been in Los Angeles, so it was pretty much the remnants of the old boys of summer team from Brooklyn that beat the White Sox. But we thought at the time that this was going to point the way to a brilliant future. Next. The 60s unfold. Bill Veeck traded away the cream of the crop of the farm system in 1960 to have a surprise repeat. He desperately wanted to have a repeat. So he traded away Earl Batty and Norm Cash and Johnny Callison, Don Mincher, and minor leaguers that later went on to have great success in professional baseball. The White Sox did not win in 1960 or any year thereafter. This is a familiar scene, Mickey Mantle hitting a home run in Comiskey Park. Where are all the people? Well, it's hard to say. The Yankees are in town. Attendance starts to become a problem in the 1960s. Comiskey told me that in the 1950s that he and his mother and sister had talked about getting a new ballpark and leaving the South Side. But it was a pipe dream. They didn't have the money to do it. But the idea was already planted in the 1950s that Comiskey Park was going to soon outlive its usefulness. Next. By 1964, Mayor Daley was interested in building a multi-purpose stadium to host the Bears and the White Sox, with the assumption that the Cubs would remain in Wrigley Field. Daley envisioned a stadium right near Navy Pier, jutting out into the lake. And by that time, Bill Veeck had sold the team to Arthur Allen, who was the gentleman second from the right, and his brother John, who later bought the White Sox from Art in 1969. And that's Muggs Hallis, and they're looking at the rendering of the future stadium, and nobody looks very happy because neither the Sox or the Bears were willing or eager to share a facility with the other. The Bears shared Wrigley Field with the Cubs. There was a symbiotic relationship between the Cubs and the White Sox. There was no connectivity between the White Sox and the Bears. And there's still a lot of South Side fans that root for the Cardinals because they remember the Chicago Cardinals and never really got around to supporting the Chicago Bears even now. But this idea fell by the wayside, and the idea for a new stadium faded into oblivion, at least for the interim. Next. It was the building of the Dan Ryan Expressway and the access of the Dan Ryan elevated line that helped keep Comiskey Park intact through the next couple of decades. Getting to that ballpark before the expressway was a huge problem. You had to navigate Wentworth Avenue and the side streets, and if you were coming from downtown after work for a night game, a huge difficulty doing it. Although the parking was certainly more than adequate. They had parking lots everywhere. So they gave it a whitewash, they painted the brickwork white, and that was essentially the only upgrades that were made to the stadium during the 1960s and 1970s, were these cosmetic look changes, but it didn't address the serious infrastructure problems of the stadium. Next. Well, in 1968, the 17-year run in the first division ended. The White Sox fell to 8th place. Al Lopez replaced Eddie Stanky as manager, and the White Sox were again wandering in the desert through 1968, 69, and 70. So when in doubt, the White Sox at a crucial moment, what's the better answer? Let's change the uniform. So they adopted this blue and white uniform, which looks a whole lot like the Kansas City Royals uniform, and they wore that in the 1969 and 1970 season. They also installed AstroTurf in the infield, thinking that that was going to stimulate fan interest. They put in an artificial shortened fence in the outfield to make spacious Comiskey Park more home run friendly. But none of this worked. In 1970, they drew an attendance of 495,000. Those are attendance figures that were typical from the Depression era of the 1930s. In 1970, a successful team would draw between 1.3 million and 1.8 million each year, 495,000. So again, the White Sox were rumored to be up for sale. Art Allen tried to sell the White Sox to the city of Milwaukee in 1969, but John stepped in at the 11th hour and was given a family discount and purchased the White Sox from his brother. John Allen is the unsung hero. He operated the White Sox for the next 6 seasons. Next. His smartest move was bringing in Harry Carey to announce the White Sox games in 1971. Great stories about Harry Carey abound. Supposedly, he had lost his job in St. Louis because of an alleged, and I use that word alleged, romantic adventure with one of the Bushes, the wives of one of the Bushes, and was fired. He got struck by an automobile in downtown St. Louis and broke his leg, and there were further allegations that somebody was trying to run him over. He went to Oakland for one unhappy year and then came to Chicago, his kind of town, in 1971. Broadcast the Sox for the next 10 seasons, and then became more famously known as the voice of the Cubs from 82, through, I think, what was the year Harry retired? 1997, I think it was. So he became better known as a Cub announcer, and I think if you ask young people, they have no clue that Harry was once the voice of the White Sox. Next. But again, after a bad year, change the uniform. This time, it's red and white. Chuck Tanner, the new White Sox manager, was really impressed with the success of the Cincinnati Reds, who called their 1970 pennant-winning team the Big Red Machine. So he said, well, we're going to have the Big White Machine, and we're going to give them red as their color. Dick Allen to the left, Bill Melton in the middle, and Carlos May to the right. Note Carlos May's right hand. You see his thumb is missing. That was blown off in a mortar accident during Marine maneuvers in 1969 at Camp Pendleton. But for the next 3 years, 71, 72, and 73, attendance was up. The White Sox climbed back up, and they drew 1.3 million in 1973, which is pretty impressive considering where they were. But Dick Allen had a season-ending injury in 73. He came back in 74, got bored with the team, and quit the team abruptly at the end of the 74 season. And losing his meal ticket that brought in so many people, attendance plummeted in 1975, and John Allen was on the verge of bankruptcy. Next. Enter Bill Veeck for a second time. Bill Veeck came in and shored up John Allen's payroll when Allen was about to default on his payment to his players. Now, I argue that part of the White Sox undoing had a lot to do with the failure of Veeck's first regime in the early 1960s. He traded away the cream of the farm system. Bill Veeck is deserving of Hall of Fame admittance, and he is a member of the Hall of Fame, but he never really built a team from scratch. He inherited that Cleveland Indian team that won a pennant in 1948. He did nothing with the St. Louis Browns except help move them to Baltimore. And with the White Sox, with the exception of one memorable season in 1977, the Southside Hitmen year, the team was a second division loser that could not afford to sign notable free agents just as the era of free agency was dawning. But here's Veeck. This is a photo, classic image of Veeck with his turtleneck sweater, his cigarettes, his glasses, and always on the phone. Whenever you met Bill Veeck, he always had a phone within a foot of him, always in constant communication. Well, I was 23 years old when I met Bill Veeck in 1976, and I remember going down to the White Sox barge room, and he was sitting there with Bill Gleason and Paul Richards and John Carmichael, the legendary Daily News columns. And between those guys, there were maybe 200 years of baseball experience and the stories they told. And I was really in awe, to meet these guys. But I had later dealings with Veeck, and not all good. And I saw Veeck from a different perspective. This is not to diminish his accomplishments in baseball, but in truth, he was a better promoter than he was a baseball builder of a successful team. Next. And he changed the uniforms, gave us those awful clam digger pants, the softball style jersey, returned white stockings to the uniform, and we became a laughing stock when we were on the road. I remember how many cities I went to during the Veeck year to see the Sox play, and these uniforms were seen as a clown act. But curiously enough, when you see today all these teams that wear dark pants and light, the two-tone look, I guess is something we have to give Bill Veeck credit for. I'm a traditionalist. I don't like two-tone uniforms, but so be it. Chet Lemon anchored that Southside Hitmen team. They won 90 games. They came out of nowhere after losing 97 the year before, and then went back to losing 90 games again in 1978. Next. Well, Veeck tried to sell the White Sox and move them out of Chicago. He approached Marvin Davis in 1980 with a proposal to move the White Sox to Denver, concluding, and rightfully so, that the Cubs had taken over the Chicago media. Coverage was uneven between the White Sox and the Cubs, and if it was uneven back in 1980, look at it now. The Cubs front page every day. The White Sox often get buried on page 3 or 4, and then they're in the Tribune especially, you see Cub coverage completely surrounding the little article on the White Sox. It's only gotten worse over the years, and that has hurt the White Sox in their ability to draw fans and to generate enthusiasm. So failing in his attempt to sell the Sox to Marvin Davis, he had a proposal to sell the team to Edward DiBartolo of Youngstown, Ohio, but DiBartolo's son owned the San Francisco 49ers, and there was racetrack interest in New Orleans, and Commissioner Bowie Kuhn decided that organized crime is associated with horse racing, and therefore we cannot sanction the sale to DiBartolo. So giving up with DiBartolo, Jerry Reinsdorf from Skokie and the principal of the Belker Company, real estate development firm, acquired the White Sox for the sum of $20 million. Beck had paid $10 million for the team in 1976. Reinsdorf bought it for $20 million, and now the ballpark is, the team itself is worth over $1 billion. So he kind of made out good on that deal. Following Beck was a tough act for Jerry Reinsdorf by his own admission. And he didn't pretend to be Beck, and he ran into a lot of problems. He didn't understand effective communications with the media, and he just gave the impression that he and his partner Eddie Einhorn were a couple of greedy guys looking to come in and evict all of the old Friday night beer drinkers, the beer sloshers, and replace it with family entertainment. And the blue-collar identity of the Southside White Sox was interwoven with the steel mills, with the certain persona of the White Sox fans. I remember the Friday night fights at Old Comiskey Park. You would see these yellow-jacketed security guards that were off-duty Chicago police running from one end of the concourse to the other, just putting out one fight after another. It was a rowdy place. And Reinsdorf said, we're going to turn this into a family operation, and that alienated a lot of fans. But with an infusion of cash, the White Sox rebuilt the team quickly and became competitive within a year. Next. Carlton Fisk's free agent signing to begin the 1981 season proved that the White Sox were serious about emerging as a major contender. Fisk played more years with the White Sox than he did with Boston, but actually went into the Hall of Fame as the Boston Red Sox. Next. In '83, we were winning ugly. We won 99 games that year. A well-balanced team that Chet Lemon came in the Beck era, but key trades and acquisitions made the Sox a division winner. It was the first major title of any kind for a Chicago team since the Bears of 1963, excluding the Chicago Sting, of course, of 1980. Winning ugly became the theme when Texas Ranger manager Doug Rader said, oh, the White Sox aren't winning legitimately, they're winning ugly. So that became our battle cry, and T-shirts were created. How many of you remember T-shirts being created for the Addison White Sox? There were some that were sold. Don, do you remember that? Yeah. Next. Tom Seaver came in 1984. Again, another uniform change. This was the result of a fan contest sponsored in 1981. At the very least, we lead baseball in fashion changes. Reinsdorf said to me once, he said that when they signed Seaver as a free agent to begin the '84 season, he said we were going to call the printing company and order our playoff tickets to have them ready for October. Well, the best laid plans. The Sox won only 77 games that year, and were never a factor. Reinsdorf said then later that he never took anything for granted in baseball, and that is what I told my Cub fan friends after the Cubs won the 2016 World Series. I heard somebody say, oh, we're going to be there again. Oh, we're going to have a dynasty. Baseball is the hardest sport of them all to build a dynasty these days. And I said, be careful. I said, don't go out making those predictions. And the National League has just gotten stronger, and it'll be interesting to see what the Cubs can do this year. Next. Well, the rebuilding was successful. There were some bad years in the mid-1980s as the stadium crisis took shape. Frank Thomas was one of 4 top draft picks over a 4-year period that brought Alex Fernandez and Thomas and Jack McDowell. And with those players and Robin Ventura, the nucleus of a successful decade of the 1990s was formed. Next. Robin Ventura gets punched out by Nolan Ryan in Texas. This was not one of Robin's finer moments. Nolan Ryan, age 42, whizzed a fastball behind Ventura's head in a game one night, and Ventura charged out to the mound, and Nolan Ryan, the grizzled old veteran, put him in a headlock and began beating on his head. I don't think this is a photo that Robin would necessarily want to show his kids. Next. There you see Comiskey Park as the stadium crisis unfolded. Look at those walls. The paint is peeling off. Look at the rust forming on the upper deck railings. And it was I wrote an article for Chicago History Magazine. I called it the Southside Baseball Factory. There was nothing notable or distinctive about Comiskey Park as, say, compared to Fenway Park in Boston. It was an angular, dead ball era park, making it very hard for teams and players to hit home runs. It was the events that happened there and not the stadium itself that had to be preserved. But we could preserve our memories, but it was impossible to preserve that stadium. Next. The ballpark, after the enabling legislation passed in 1988, was torn down, and the demolition began just as the new ballpark, originally called Comiskey Park 2, opened up across the street. There you see the wrecking ball doing its damage, and I was sorry to see it go, as we all were, but it was inevitable. Next. With it went legendary McCuddy's Tap, the famous bar across the street on 35th Street. Frances McCuddy had inherited that bar from her grandfather, who opened it in 1910 when Charles Comiskey told the McCuddy family, "You might be smart to open up a bar across the street from the park." It was said that Babe Ruth used to drop in there in the 7th inning or so when his team was at bat to quaff a beer and then run back across the street. Frances McCuddy was a dear little Irish lady with white hair. She stood all of 4'5" and weighed maybe 85 pounds soaking wet. And she said at the time, that Governor Thompson was going to help her keep her place open. Jim Thompson, in my interview with him, told me, he says, "Yeah," he said, "I thought I could do it. We were in there one night," Thompson says, "my guys and I were in there after a Sox game. We were having a couple of beers and we were all in a good mood and feeling real good. And Francis came up to me and said, 'Governor, can you help me save my bar?' And Thompson said, 'Oh, of course, Francis, we'll have this included. We'll build a ballpark around McCuddy's, we'll do that.' And so she had that assurance. But be careful what you wish for, and if you're in public life, be careful about the promises you make. Thompson said that his team searched fruitlessly for a location there to relocate that bar and couldn't come up with it. He says, "Here I am, I'm the governor of Illinois, and I'm trying to save a little tiny saloon in Bridgeport." And he said, "I could get roads built, I could get highways built, and everything built, but I can't find a home for McCuddy's Tap." He said he felt very bad about that, and he said it's one of the moments that he regrets the most of his gubernatorial reign. And ironically enough, the man who saved the White Sox was a Cub fan. But he too didn't want it on his tombstone that he lost the White Sox to St. Petersburg, Florida. So there you see the wrecking ball hitting McCuddy's. It's a distant memory, but what a great memory it was. Next. Here's Governor Thompson. I tried to ask him what the promises he made to the legislators that night, July 1st, 1988. And I interviewed him in his office at Winston Strawn downtown. And he was one of two men who had a completely empty desk. The other being Phil Corboy, the famous personal injury lawyer. When you go into a prominent man's office and you see an empty desk with only a telephone on it, you know you're in the presence of power. And he had his Lincoln memorabilia and all of his historic artifacts that he collected in glass cases, and he had a large office and an empty desk. But he smiled and he said, "I can't tell you what I promised them." He says, "because some of them I don't even remember." Next. So we got this ballpark opened up on April 1991. And when you look at it, what do you see? You see a flying saucer landing on a structure. The color was all wrong. It was blue. Remember I told you it came in under budget. The budget was 130 million, it came in at 119. They eliminated a lot of accoutrement that might have made this ballpark look a lot more friendly and welcoming. So we got a functional new ballpark and acres of parking, and the fans hated it. Sox had record attendance in the first 2 years, but then it fell off. Complainers would say you needed a Sherpa guide to navigate your way up to the top of the upper deck. It really was steep. In the 1993 playoffs, I sat in the far distant corner in the upper deck in right field. I couldn't even hear the crowd. The winds were swirling, it was cold, and you couldn't even hear the crowd noise being that far away from home plate. Well, the fans complained and complained and complained, and finally in 2000, the naming rights were given to U.S. Cellular Corporation. They invested a huge amount of private capital to renovate the ballpark. Next. So you got a much more retro look to the rehabbed Comiskey Park, as you see here. The upper deck was shaved off to a point. The seats were converted to a more traditional forest green color. The wrought iron detailing in the upper deck was a homage to Yankee Stadium and its overhanging metal ironwork. And on the whole, the ballpark started to look a little better than it had, but still the attendance problems lingered. Next. As you can see here, this is before the green seats were put in. They added that little deck in left field for kids to play baseball on during the game, but game's not yet starting, but again, almost the entire upper deck is empty. What would have happened if they had been to Addison? It really begs the question. Next. Northern Illinois even played a football game here some years back, and that too doesn't look like it was a very well attended event. But you can see that baseball-only facilities generally don't work for professional football, and the Cubs and the Bears came to that conclusion in 1971 when the Bears moved to Soldier Field. Next. The naming rights has always been controversial. When it became U.S. Cellular Field, this fan held up the banner, "Can we have Comiskey Park back, please?" Well, it only got worse. U.S. Cellular Corporation pulled out of the Chicago market, but hung on to their naming rights until the contract expired 2 years ago, and Guaranteed Rate Field is what it became. And their logo shows an arrow pointing down. That has got to be a bad omen for a baseball team to have your arrow pointing down, right? And the fans made note of that. Next. But in the early 2000s, the White Sox finally emerged as a championship team. Key acquisitions brought in Paul Konerko for Mike Cameron from the Cincinnati Reds. Konerko, a failed catcher and third baseman, became a first baseman and a career player with the team. Likely not a Hall of Famer, but really the anchor to the great success that was to follow. Next. A.J. Przinsky, you need a guy like that on the team. You need a guy who chews nails and who wins by whatever it takes. He had heart, and a lot of it. He was a brawler. Wasn't popular in some of the other cities he played in, San Francisco, Minnesota, but he was the glue that made the White Sox change them from a competitive team to a championship team. Next. And then came 2005. I still rub my eyes in disbelief every time I look at this photo. I said, no, this didn't really happen. My White Sox that lost 106 games in 1970, the team that lost 100 games last year, going to the World Series and winning the World Series? How could such a thing happen? The night they won the World Series in Houston, I was seated at Schaller's Pump in Bridgeport, and with Alderman Jim Balker of the 11th Ward. And as we watched the White Sox win that game, we were talking about building Comiskeyville, kind of like Wrigleyville. And the alderman said, "Rich," he says, "not going to happen." He says, "the neighbors won't allow saloons on 35th Street. I said, "I get that, but how about across the Dan Ryan, where the Robert Taylor homes were?" He says, "Nope, that's federal property, you can't touch it." He says, "What we can do is give them Comiskeyville at 35th and Halsted." And I said, "But that's a mile away from the ballpark. The fans aren't going to walk from the ballpark to go hang out at a saloon on Halsted Street. He says, well, we want to develop Halsted Street. It was run down, it was boarded up, it was terrible, but it's too far away from the park. I had a colleague and friend named Pete Donahue who bought the rights to the old police training academy and started retrofitting it to create a sports bar, not bothering to see how hard it would be to get a liquor license. And he absolutely failed in the attempt and had to sell his interest in the bar. And Reinsdorf later told Pete that if they ever tear down the grammar school in back of the ballpark, that it would build a saloon for Pete. Well, the grammar school is still there, and Pete long since gave up the idea. Next. Celebrating in Houston, the same Pete Donahue, who's quite a character, flew down to Houston with 4 friends the day before the World Series game in Houston, Game 3. I said, well, did you have tickets? He said, no, I didn't need tickets. I says, well, who do you know? He says, I didn't know anybody. I said, well, how'd you get in? He said, through the sheer force of my personality. And you know where he sat? 3 rows in back of President George Bush, right in back of the field. This is the same Pete Donahue who, during a B.B. King concert in Chicago, went up to the suite, knocked on the door, got admitted to a private party with B.B. King, and when the curtains opened up, there was Pete standing on the stage in back of B.B. King. These are true stories, you can't make them up. Next. And there's AJ getting punched out by Cub catcher Michael Barrett in 2006. AJ would heckle the opposing catchers. He would get under their skin just enough to turn them, to really flip them out. And Barrett, who didn't take any nonsense, punches out AJ. It really had quite an effect because a week later, Michael Barrett was released by the Cubs. AJ was the great disruptor. Next. Mark Burley in 2009 on a Wednesday afternoon tosses a perfect game. On a Wednesday afternoon in a game that was meaningless, look how filled those outfield stands were. Did those people know that this was going to be a perfect game? But there he is in the 9th inning, pitching the second perfect game in White Sox history. The third one would come a couple years later. Next. Robin Ventura, looking much more dignified than he did when he was getting punched out by Nolan Ryan, is appointed manager, succeeding Ozzie Guillen, and it was just a bad decision made by Jerry Reinsdorf, who rewards all of his friends with jobs, and it's a noble thing to reward loyalty, but to be perfectly honest, Robin was not prepared to be a manager, and the results were very evident. The farm system collapsed. The White Sox are in a rebuilding period, which I believe, I almost call it a perpetual rebuilding period. It's one reason I believe why Manny Machado did not sign with the White Sox. So Robin lasted, and even when Joe Maddon became available, I thought to myself, the White Sox got to go get Joe Maddon. Fire Robin Ventura, hire Joe Maddon. This is what Chuck Comiskey did in 1956. He fired Marty Marion when he heard that Al Lopez, the great Cleveland Indian manager, his contract was up, and Comiskey went in and snatched Lopez and brought him to Chicago. That's what the White Sox should have, could have, didn't do. So we had Robin through some bad years. Joe Maddon leaves the Cubs out of the wilderness and into the promised land, and here we are still fumbling along. Next. Jose Abreu, I thought, was the beginning of the rebuilding period. 2013 was a horrible year. I thought that's when the rebuilding program truthfully began with the signing of Cuban free agent Jose Abreu. But the White Sox spin guys have said this is year 3 of the rebuild. Well, weren't they rebuilding in 2013, 14, and 15? Why did they suddenly declare that 2016 marked the beginning of the rebuild? What were they doing in those first couple of years? In my mind, it's been a rebuild since 2005. But I guess I tend to look at things with a more cynical, detached eye, which is my right of having suffered through 50 plus years of being a fan. Next, Chris Sale, a stud, great pitcher. Led the Boston Red Sox to the World Series. this could conceivably become one of the worst trades in White Sox history. I have no faith in Yoan Moncada. I think that what we've seen is what we've got, a guy who's going to strike out a lot, a guy who's not going to hit much more than 250. He may become a good fielder, but even that, the jury's out on that. They've just moved him to third base. Michael Kopech is undergoing Tommy John surgery, this great promising pitcher that we got in this trade. And Louis Alexander Basabe looks to me like a utility outfielder buried in the minor leagues. Meanwhile, Chris Sale's this daunting, scary pitcher with this 100-mile-an-hour fastball, and he's all legs and all angles, and imagine facing this guy. And we give him literally to the Boston Red Sox. The jury is still out on this trade. It'll be a few more years, but I don't know. Next. Well, here's one of our future players, Carson Fulmer from Vanderbilt University. He just got sent down. And unfortunately, I think that is what is happening with the future of the White Sox rebuild.
In addition to the Addison referendum in 1986, Bloomingdale Township also put a referendum on the same ballot, but you had to live in Bloomingdale Township in order to vote on it. So the advisory referendum in Addison was for Village of Addison residents, and it said, shall a sports stadium be built in Addison? And that's the referendum that failed by 43 votes. In Bloomingdale Township, which is technically where the property is located at, which is now the Hamilton Partners property, the entire township of Bloomingdale, which included Glendale Heights and the village of Bloomingdale and the unincorporated properties there, had the opportunity to vote on a binding referendum. And it was a two-part referendum saying, should the township of Bloomingdale acquire the property in question and then sell bonds to make that purchase. I don't believe that passed because it was the entire township, and the entire township would have had to bear the cost of the acquisition of that property. And that is today what you see out there is Hamilton, the Swift Meadows Business Park by Hamilton Partners.
Is anybody going to opening day? Cub tickets are impossible to find, but you're more than welcome at 35th and Shields. I'm sure that they will say, come on in, as they all do. But I'm not optimistic for the year. I think it's going to be another year of disappointment and rebuilding, and I don't believe that magical 2020 season, which the White Sox point to as when they suddenly become competitive, is going to happen. At this point in the Cub rebuild, it was 2015. The Cubs had signed that great Boston Red Sox pitcher, and they turned the corner in 2015, and suddenly they won a division title. The White Sox are at the same point the Cubs were in the time frame, but they're nowhere near achieving that level of success, which tells me that the rebuild is still years off. I hate to convey that disappointing news, but that's the views of a cynic. And I thank you for your time in coming out. Thank you.